Welcome to the School Sucks Project, a podcast, YouTube channel, and online community dedicated to personal growth and intellectual self-defense.
We promote learning alternatives, home education, critical thinking, peaceful parenting, organization and productivity, and better communication strategies.
Please remember to visit schoolsucksproject.com to get comprehensive show notes, relevant links,
or to just leave comments.
Follow us on Twitter at SchoolSucksShow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, username School Sucks Podcast, and get involved in our Facebook group. Just search for School Sucks Project.
Steve, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Well, we are moving on now to the fourth principle, which you described originally as doubting everybody, right?
Yes.
And I think this relates actually to something that you said in an earlier show. Assume everybody is doing almost everything wrong, correct?
Yes, that's my life motto, is assume everybody is wrong about everything.
Right.
This principle is essentially a mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It is assuming that people don't know what they're talking about, that you don't know what you're talking about, and that includes the teachers, the professors, your peers, yourself, your parents, your pastors, everybody. You have to force yourself into this mindset of, okay, I'm just going to assume that people don't know the basics, they don't understand what they're talking about, and I'm going to kind of start from my own square one.
Yeah, and self is a really important one. We're going to get to that more in the next show. But I just worry, and I think a lot of this is me talking from my own experience. Like, once I felt in life like I had a sufficient amount of answers, everybody else was a fool. You know, I think that happens. And I also think that comes from a waking up to how much diversity of opinion in the world there actually is, and how confusing it is to, and really how difficult it is to arrive at what we call truth. Right. And we want to take shortcuts, especially when we first learn that, oh, all right, well, everything you learned, you know, in government school between the ages of 6 and 17 was wrong, or almost everything. I mean, you know, there were some basics there that were delivered correctly and useful later in life. But certainly, you know, in the realm of history or the sciences or the humanities, you've gotten a lot of bad information. And a higher education certainly doesn't put a stop to that problem, as we've discussed before. But I remember getting into higher education and having a lot of previous beliefs disassembled and saying, now I know. And there's a lot of people who are 19, 20, 21 years old running around the world with that mindset right now. So I think that just in the beginning here, because I do have a lot of young listeners, that we put emphasis on self-doubt as being a very important feature of doubting everybody.
Yes, and I like very much your phrase that there is a staggering amount of diversity of opinions and ideas in the world. And what I would say is not only is there an amazing amount of diversity, but there's an amazing amount of nuance. It's not just that a lot of people have different ideas, it's that those ideas can be actually very rigorously defended. And what's very tempting is as you learn about the world and as you gain an education, you start thinking that people who disagree with you are just dumb. And you cut them out and say, well, their whole worldview is just utterly ridiculous. I can't possibly comprehend how they would believe such stupid ideas, and you move on. That is a methodological error. Even radical ideas like communism, for example, or anarchism, you have to very carefully identify those underlying philosophic principles in those two worldviews in order to judge accurately whether or not those are reasonable conclusions. And this what I call this is a framing error, that people make framing errors all the time entirely as a function of their lack of skepticism and their lack of doubt. So, for example, in economics, a framing error would look something like, well, should the tax rate be 12.5% or 25%? You know, or you have Bernie Sanders says, oh, maybe it should be 70%. Well, no, that's a framing error. The debate should be, should we have an income tax at all? Same with the minimum wage. Should it be $7.15 or should it be $10.10 or $15 like it is in Seattle? Well, no, that's a framing error. So that is something that you have to avoid like the plague when you are trying to actually critically understand how the world works.
Yeah, and one really unfortunate phenomenon there is that we live in a world of framing errors, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
whenever somebody asks the right questions, or maybe not the right questions, but the deeper questions, politically, economically, philosophically, they immediately look insane because everybody else swims in this water of accepted or overlooked framing errors.
Yes, you see that all the time. It's virtually ubiquitous. And it's funny because years ago when I used to ask some of these questions, people would ask me, I'd ask things like, well, I wonder, should we even have a government, at all? Like, does anybody talk about that? People would ask me, they would say, Steve, are you high? I was like, what are you talking about? I'm high. Like, oh, you're saying all these crazy things. It's like, what? That's not crazy. What's crazy is thinking that somehow this essential question has resolved itself without examination.
Right. Absolutely. So I think too that an interesting feature of this fourth principle is it's a kind of warning or a kind of defense against people who are out there operating without a grounding or an understanding of the first three principles that we discussed. A focus on technique, being guided by what's the most efficient, and ultimately, a mastery of the most basic aspects of any kind of pursuit. But they're presenting themselves as teachers, gurus, and I've certainly been burned on this a time or two. And to be completely honest, I've also been guilty of this. If you have a podcast, people are coming to you oftentimes for answers. Now, I have a small area of expertise where I feel very, very comfortable in what I'm talking about related to school and alternative education. But in 6+ years, I've expanded well beyond that, and not always so tactfully so, I have to admit. And I try to correct errors when I make them. So I think that's an important thing to point out, too, that we're really here trying to provide a warning against that, even people who are in these high positions or these credentialed positions out there could really, really be falling down on the first three. But there's a lot of people who are not noticing that. We've talked about names like Sam Harris in previous shows.
Yes. So this is absolutely essential. There are both theoretical and empirical reasons that one should have this default position of skepticism. Mm-hmm. So theoretically speaking, it's just a methodological proposition that trusting somebody based on their status or their name or their credentials is something that obviously, if you just abstract away from the specifics, is not a sound way to arrive at conclusions. I believe X because person Joe said X is true. Mm-hmm. That is a flawed methodology for reasoning, and it's certainly a flawed methodology for understanding. You can't possibly understand what you're talking about if you just believe your conclusions because somebody told you. So that's the theory. Empirically speaking, though, as you do your own research and you gain a real understanding about whatever topics you're interested in, what you will find, I can practically guarantee, is that the expert mainstream consensus is usually foundationally flawed. It's not just a little bit wrong. It's foundationally flawed because of these framing errors and what we talked about last time when we were talking about the basics. People don't examine the basics, and so they make these catastrophically big errors. And that's something you see at the highest levels of credentialing. That's something that affects the Paul Krugmans of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And think about Paul Krugman won a Nobel Prize. Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? That is like, there are some credentialing organizations saying this person has demonstrated competence in whatever it is, and like making the world a more peaceful place. And demonstrably speaking, Barack Obama has not made the world a more peaceful place, and therefore it damns the credentialing organization. So for both those reasons, you also see it not just in the world of ideas, but you also see it when you're trying to learn skills. I keep coming back to the martial arts because that's something I've been doing a while. But you go around and there's a lot of people who have a lot of medals and trophies in their dojo, and they've been training for 25 years. And in terms of understanding how to defend themselves, not just do some flashy kicks and punches, but in terms of how to actually defend themselves, they don't know what they're talking about. They think they know what they're talking about, but they actually don't. And so if you're going to try to learn from them, it has to be through this lens first of skepticism.
Let me ask you this. With respect to the martial arts, do you feel like there's this kind of insularity effect where people have a dojo, let's say, some kind of teacher, but the only time they're in situations where they have to actually defend themselves, or not even really defend themselves, is when they're basically like doing demonstrations for students who they can easily overwhelm, but they're not actually out there like competing? Is that like a regular thing that happens from your experience?
To say that there is insularity in the world of the martial arts is a euphemism, to be honest. That it is incredibly insular, divided by school, divided by your general martial arts style that you're training, incredibly. So you have this real phenomena of people who train in karate for 20 years, and they have this dojo, and they're super well respected in, Isshinryu karate or whatever. And in their, they've regional champions, and they do all their karate tournaments, and everybody respects them. They've got a bunch of stripes on their black belt, and, all the students are like, they walk in and they have their attention because, wow, here's this amazing person. And sure enough, those people, according to the rules of the dojo and the framing of karate tournaments and the rules of karate, those people can beat their students in these, according to the rules of karate, which are very different rules than the rules of self-defense. So you have all of these people who think, oh man, this person can beat anybody else because they're moving in a particular way that's very constrained by their rules that they're not aware of. And here's the sinister thing, is it's almost embarrassing. You have somebody that can have a very small amount of training in something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I keep coming back to, or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which is based on the actual principles of self-defense, go into this dojo where you have this person, the 9-stripe black belt, and destroy them, right? And when they're not playing by the karate rules, they're playing by real rules, they can get absolutely destroyed, and it's embarrassing to watch. There are cringeworthy videos on YouTube. If you want to honestly cringe and like well up because you're seeing somebody's worldview shatter in front of them. There are videos of an old, I think it's like a Qigong master, which is kind of it's called an internal martial art. It's kind of like Tai Chi, where you have these very soft and flowy, beautiful movements, great for your health and well-being. He thought, he was probably in his 50s or 60s, he thought that he had developed this incredible style where he was so powerful, he didn't even have to touch his opponents. He could just do this move and get an inch from them. Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of them out there. And the students would go, oh, they would just feel all the chi flowing through them and they'd be zapped to the ground, right? And whether or not the students were deluded to believe this, I'm not sure. It's very possible. But there's a video of a mixed martial artist who's going in and actually fights this guy and cracks his head open. I mean, like, it throws kicks to his head, punches to his head, and you hear these terrible, cringeworthy sounds of this old guy, and his face gets all bloodied, and it's like, oh my gosh, how could it be that this person could have so much respect in the world of the martial arts and be so self-deluded that he actually thought that he could defend himself? It's entirely a function of framing errors, that he had this framing error for 30 years of his lifetime, and it resulted in utter embarrassment.
That's interesting, too, because now you said it was Qigong was...
I think it was Qigong. It might have been Kung Fu. There's a lot of Asian martial arts that are more internal than external.
Just for my sake and for the sake of the people listening, do you have any search suggestions for how we could find this video?
Sure. So just go to YouTube and do Kung Fu Master versus MMA. That's probably miscategorized as something like that.
Okay.
And there's a ton of them. There's a ton of them out there. You can take your pick of all these cringeworthy videos. And it's not just, too, I want to say, it's not just these internal flowy martial arts. This is also true in things like karate. You have Karate Master versus Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and these people who are throwing good punches and kicks but have no ground game still get their butts handed to them.
Very interesting. So yeah, it's almost like I'm such a novice. Sometimes it's even hard to know the right questions to ask. Still, even after 4 previous conversations, but it seems like anybody who isn't fluid in MMA is going to get their ass kicked by somebody, right? Unless you have a balanced approach to different styles. Somebody is out there, and again, this comes back to that word insularity. right? This might work in your dojo with novice people who are practicing the same thing, but there's somebody out there who can beat you using some different style or technique.
Yes, so MMA is just an acronym for mixed martial arts.
Right.
And in that world, what has emerged as dominant styles are Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, which are two grappling styles. It's not about punches and kicks as it is joint locks and throws. And boxing and karate to some degree, and Muay Thai are kind of the hard striking styles. So mixed martial artists will have this, if they know what they're doing, they'll have a well-rounded, not necessarily a mastery of the basics, but a competence in the basics in all of these different styles. And what you discover, especially in the earlier days of mixed martial arts, where it was unclear which style was the best, when you have great deficiencies in, let's say, your ground game, and somebody is competent in having a ground game, they're going to win 99% of the matchups. So you can't have these big holes in your game if you want to have any chance in mixed martial arts. And mixed martial arts is kind of the closest analogy to real street fighting. It's still a little different. You still have some rules. You have rounds, for example. You have 3 5-minute rounds, which is nothing at all like you'd have in the street. So it still changes the game a little bit, but it's much closer than karate tournaments or Tai Chi tournaments or anything like that.
All right, I got you. It's interesting, just back to this, the Kung Fu master, he probably appeared to have the relaxation part mastered.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So we talked before, that's kind of blown out of the water by someone who is going to force him to work in a different way.
Yes, it depends on your end goal. That's actually a very good point, because if your goal is to have the internal benefits of Qigong, for example, and you master the technique, that's great. And you can still have a masterful competence. I'm sure he was masterfully competent in that style. But if you confuse that end goal of mastering this particular discipline for these particular reasons with being able to defend yourself in the street, that's a big category error. That's a big framing error. These two things are not equal. So, and that's the thing too, is some people like this, actually in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is an excellent example, that you have more self-defense oriented styles whose end goal is how to protect yourself, practically speaking. And you have sport oriented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is how to win tournaments, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournaments. They're similar techniques, but ultimately a lot of the positions are very, very different. You could get into positions in sport jiu-jitsu that you would never get into in street jiu-jitsu, and they work. It just depends on your end goal.
Interesting. Now, let's say somebody comes to you, Steve, and they say, or he or she says, I want to learn martial arts. Mm-hmm. Okay, now this relates to some of the advice that you gave at the end of the last show, but we talked about looking for somebody who does so in an efficient way and in a relaxed way. How can a novice, when searching out a teacher, assess those things? Assess basically an adherence and a really solid understanding of the first 3 principles that we discussed.
It's an excellent question, and the answer is very difficult. And precisely the reason that you see so many martial arts teachers that don't necessarily know what they're talking about, and they have big dojos, is because that's a very difficult problem to assess. How does somebody who doesn't know the basics, who doesn't know what they're talking about, assess that somebody does know? There are a couple of ways. And what I would say is, number one, you have to go, everybody that you're evaluating, you have to have this lens of doubt is number one. It doesn't matter how big a game they talk. It doesn't matter how many trophies they have. You have to have this lens of, let's just assume that they don't know what they're talking about, and then they can prove to me that they do. One of the ways is you have to try to find a way that they can demonstrate their competence. So, for example, in this dojo that I'm training now with a guy that I have a massive amount of respect for, class number 1, he takes you personally and he puts you on the ground and he mounts you, which means he puts both his legs over you in this very dominant position. And he says, okay, now what would you do? And like he acts like he's going to punch you. What would you do in this position? How would you try to escape? And if you don't know what you're doing, as I didn't know because I was never in that position, even after a decade of martial arts, I had never been in that position before for any extended period of time. I didn't know. I kind of floundered around and did everything wrong. He said, okay, try this. And he said, you do it to me. And then he showed me, it's called trap and roll, simple technique to get out of the mount. He said, you try it. And you put your leg here, you lift your hips this way, you grab the arm. That is a demonstration of competence, a very clear demonstration. And then we did several more techniques like that. A lot of times what you'll find is the people that have these big egos and think, gosh, I'm too good for the lowly students. They won't do that kind of stuff. They won't be like, look, I'm going to show you right now, this is the technique that will get you out of this particular position, and this is why. So that's one or I suppose that's two, is you have to doubt and you have to have a demonstration of competence. But let me give you a personal example. When I was living in upstate New York, I really wanted to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because I had looked online at all of these fights, and I've been interested in the martial arts. I thought, gosh, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's the real deal. It is demonstrated in video after video after video after video after video that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is something you have to master, or you have to have a grounding in if you want to be a competent martial artist. So I knew that had already been demonstrated online, not necessarily in person, but the place that I was living had no Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools nearby. There was one that was like 45 minutes away, but I wasn't going to try to do that. So there was a Japanese Jiu-Jitsu dojo that was maybe 20 minutes away. It was near the school that I was getting my education at. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are very different. And I understood going into it that, okay, this is going to be foundationally very different. You have to have the mindset of doubt during the process of learning something that doesn't necessarily have the best basics. So the techniques that I learned in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu are really cool, and they certainly work in particular circumstances. But while I was learning it, I was consciously thinking to myself, okay, I can't make this my core basic technique in terms of grappling. I can't do it because this is I know I am learning something that is framed incorrectly. And I trained that for about 5 years. I got my black belt in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. I learned a bunch of cool things, but it was still consciously in my mind. I can't pretend that I can grapple and I'm good in really close quarters with somebody based on this training, because as it has been demonstrated, these foundationals are not right. And this is not something that most people have. Most people, they will let inaccurate techniques seep into their foundations, and then, just like you gave the example of learning the guitar the wrong way, they've developed habits which are counterproductive to their ultimate end goal. So it's a very difficult question, and you have to try to do a lot of research beforehand to try to orient yourself in what's the right style of the martial arts or whatever discipline it is, and who am I going to try to learn from, and can they demonstrate their competence to me?
Yeah, your experience and mine make me really so it is a legitimate worry about this overemphasis when it comes to learning a new discipline or a new skill. There's a real overemphasis on hard work, right? Mm-hmm. Above all. And just talking about, when you talk to somebody who's really competent or who's really even gotten notoriety for being really good at something, musical, athletic, etc., they always say, it was a lot of hard work. And people think, and, school really reinforces this as well, associating hard work with pain and having to persevere through pain and boredom to get some kind of beneficial result on the other side, that hard work is the key. Now, what you're describing with your experience, 5 years doing Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, or the example of me playing the guitar, is you can work plenty hard at something and wind up in really not the most desirable place, considering what your goals are when you first set out to learn it.
Yes, it's hard work plus an accurate thing that you're working on. Hard work by itself will get you nowhere. It will most likely end up with you developing bad habits. This is, and I've made this correlation before, but I'll make it again because I think it's very important. This is correlated very strongly in the world of ideas and philosophy, the relationship between theory and data. People think that data speaks for itself, and it does not. Data only makes sense in the context of a theory, not an empirical theory, a theory, a rationalist theory, in terms of your concepts are not something which are up for a debate. This is something that is inescapable. Data will not get you anywhere. You have to have the ultimate theory into which the data fits, just like you have to have the correct technique into which the work fits.
Absolutely. So, Steve, when we set out today, we said we were going to talk several different, I guess, practices within this principle, or things that are important to keep in mind when going forward with learning with respect to doubt. We talked about framing errors already and explained how those show up in the world. We talked about avoiding wasting time just now. And we also talked about another concept that you mentioned called the beginner's mind, right?
Yes.
Like where is the mindset, and what should be the considerations when something is brand new and possibly overwhelming. But there were a couple other important considerations for this principle as well, right?
Yes. So one of them is about trying to have the appropriate relationship between a student and teacher. And it can be between the speaker and communicator of an idea and the listener and the receiver of an idea. This is something that will inflame a lot of experts and people who are very competent in whatever they're doing. I have discovered, I think this is the case, that the way to view your instructor or the person that you're learning from is as a peer. It is as a peer who thinks that he knows a lot on any given topic, and who might even have some demonstration that he knows a lot on any given topic, and has more time in the field than you do. This is very closely related to what we were talking about in the first few episodes, that you can't view people as demigods. You can't think they're intrinsically special or there's something magical about, Roger Federer that makes him Roger Federer. No, Roger Federer is how he is because of his technique. This is also true in the process of learning from an instructor. It is not the case that everything an instructor or a competent person says is true. You can't have that mindset. You have to think, okay, this is ultimately another fellow learner who has gone through the process of learning to get where he is. He can share information with me on a peer level. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, you don't have respect for the person or anything like that. But this is something, especially I'm sure as you know, in school is the opposite of this. School is take the information that is thrown at you and regurgitate it back at the authority figure. That's the process of learning. It's all rote learning. There's no peership. There's no students looking at the teacher as, oh, you're just an advanced student, right? You're just somebody who's also, you've learned a lot. Why don't you communicate to me what you've learned, and we'll go back and forth that way. Now, I think that is absolutely essential to actually understanding what you're talking about. Is not just rote learning, not just regurgitation, though it might do well in school, is actually understanding what you're talking about. And that means you have to be able to have a real, honest dialogue with whoever you're learning from. So this, and of course, we go back to the martial arts again. This is something that is catastrophically lacking in the world of martial arts. There is this pecking order. You have the guy at top, and then you have the instructors, and then you have the advanced students, and then the intermediate, and then the beginners. And there's even in everything from the locker room to the way people communicate with one another and how people associate with one another is in this hierarchy. That is not a great atmosphere or environment or mindset to learn from.
Absolutely.